Recently, I experienced something horrifying. A man who had been in a psychiatric hospital was stalking me. I haven't dared to tell anyone about it. To this day, I can't be alone at home without feeling a creeping sense of dread. You know how, when you're sitting alone in an empty apartment, every little sound seems amplified. But what I went through was far worse than any trick of the imagination. I had just moved into a new apartment, cozy ground floor with a view of a small courtyard. The building was old with thick walls, so neighbors weren't likely to disturb me with noise. I was looking forward to peace and quiet after the hustle of the past few years. I felt comfortable in my new place, and I liked the area. The first thing that started bothering me was a faint feeling that someone was watching me. Sometimes, while sitting on the couch reading, I'd suddenly feel someone's eyes on me. I'd look around, but of course, there was no one there. It was a subtle sensation, not overpowering, but it made me uneasy. I decided to chalk it up to the stress of moving. Then I began to notice things weren't where I'd left them. At first, it was small stuff like my keys, which I usually left on the entry table, but would later find on the table in the living room. I thought maybe I'd forgotten moving them, but each day small changes piled up. One time, my toothbrush in the kitchen sink, even though I distinctly remembered leaving it in the bathroom. On the third day, I realized that the door to my apartment, which I always locked with 2 bolts, was sometimes just latched. I tried to be more vigilant, making sure to check that I'd locked it before going to bed. But in the morning, I'd find one of the bolts undone. I assumed it was just me being absent-minded. That evening, I came home late. It was around midnight. After placing my groceries on the kitchen counter, I felt a strange presence in the apartment. The air seemed different, almost thick. Even in the silence, I thought I heard faint breathing or a rustle in the hallway. Trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, I went into the bathroom, and that's when I noticed another small detail. A jar of cream wasn't in its usual spot, as though someone had moved it. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to explain it logically. Maybe I'd shifted it and forgotten. But something inside me screamed that this wasn't the case. That night, I barely slept. I lay there listening to every sound in the apartment, but nothing seemed out of place. The next morning, I decided to test something. Before leaving, I arranged a few small items on the entry shelf in a specific order. When I came back home, I went straight to the shelf and saw that the objects had been rearranged as if someone had touched them. I decided to set up a hidden camera in the kitchen, directly across from the front door. I thought that maybe it was all in my head and I'd record the video to reassure myself that nothing strange was happening. The next day after work, I immediately checked the footage, and that's when my heart stopped. On the video, I could see the door to my apartment slowly open. There was no one visible in the frame, but I could hear soft footsteps. After a few seconds, the door closed again and silence settled over the kitchen. That was it. I watched the recording several times, not believing my own eyes. Someone had clearly been in my apartment. Even though they didn't show up on camera, it was undeniable. This wasn't my imagination. Each time I rewatched the footage, my anxiety grew. Still, I didn't want to tell anyone. I was afraid they'd think I was crazy. The following night, I decided to stay alert. I sat on the couch in the dark, holding my breath, trying not to make a sound. When the clock struck midnight, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible creak of the door. I froze, listening. The footsteps were quiet, barely audible, but I could hear them. They moved closer to the living room, and finally I saw a silhouette of a person standing in the doorway. He didn't move, just stood there staring in my direction. When I saw his eyes, I froze. They held a dark rage. I sat there in the darkness, paralyzed by fear, not daring even to blink. My heart was beating so loudly I thought he'd hear it and realize I was awake. He stood there for a few more minutes before turning around and leaving. When I heard the front door close, I could finally breathe again. I sat there in the pitch-black room, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The next morning, I went straight to the police, showed them the recording, and described the night visits from the stranger. They promised to investigate and advised me not to return there, at least for a while. In the days that followed, I stayed with a friend. A few weeks later, the police contacted me. They told me they'd found the man who'd been sneaking into my apartment. It turned out he was the previous tenant. He'd rented the place 2 years ago. Something had happened and he'd been taken to a psychiatric hospital. After a year of treatment, he was released. For some reason, he'd kept a key to the apartment and would come back at night thinking it was still his. He would silently enter, wander around the rooms, sit on the couch, look over his old belongings, and then leave. It's hard to explain how I felt in that moment. On one hand, it was horrifying to realize that a stranger had been so close, almost right next to me, watching, observing my every move. On the other hand, I felt a strange relief. It wasn't supernatural or mystical, just a case of a stranger invading my personal space. I returned to my apartment a few months later after changing all the locks and installing an alarm system. Living there wasn't easy. Every creak, every rustle made me jump. But eventually, the anxiety faded and I settled back into my normal life. Yet sometimes, sitting alone in the silence, I still feel as if someone is watching me. This is a story I don't really like to remember, but it left such a deep mark on me that even years later I can't forget a single moment. Some may consider it just a coincidence or a trick of the imagination, but I'm convinced that everything actually happened. Several years ago, I was working in another city. It was a big company, good pay, prospects, basically everything people tolerate monotonous, boring routines for. My life was settled and predictable, with each day going according to schedule, and I liked it. Every evening after work, I'd go home, eat, watch TV, and go to bed. I didn't seek out adventures or anything new. It all started rather inconspicuously. One evening, I noticed someone standing by the entrance to my apartment building. It was a man in a gray coat and a cap, his figure blurred under the streetlight. He had his back to me and seemed to be waiting for someone. I thought it was odd, but decided to ignore it. Maybe he was just lost or waiting for a taxi. But the next evening, he was there again. This time, he stood a bit closer to the entrance and I could see his face better. He was an older man with short cropped hair and a serious expression. He didn't do anything suspicious, but the fact that he was there 2 nights in a row made me a bit uneasy. On the 3rd day, I saw him again, and this time our eyes met. He didn't smile, didn't greet me, just looked at me as if assessing me, then turned away. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few days passed, and I got used to his presence. Every evening he was there, sometimes standing a little further away, sometimes closer to the entrance. I began to have this strange feeling that he was watching me, though I had no evidence of it. One Friday evening, I stayed at work later than usual. As I left the building, I immediately thought of that man. A strange nervousness overcame me, and I decided to take a different route home to see if he would still be waiting in his usual spot. But this time, he wasn't there. I felt a little silly for having been so wary of him. The next day, I had to go out again. I was glad for the distraction, but as soon as I stepped outside, I saw him by the neighboring building. He was standing on the sidewalk, staring right at me. There was no doubt he was following me. I couldn't take it anymore, so I approached him and asked why he was always there and what he wanted from me. For a moment, he looked surprised at my question. He muttered something unintelligible and walked away, leaving me feeling a slight satisfaction for finally confronting him. But from then on, things only got worse. I began to see him everywhere. I'd leave the office and he'd be across the street. I'd go into a store and he'd walk by the window. I started thinking I was losing my mind or that this was some kind of cruel joke, but his face remained emotionless, calm, as if he was just observing. My colleagues began to notice. They asked why I was so nervous and anxious. I tried to explain, but when I told them everything, they just laughed and said I was probably overworked. No one took me seriously, and that only added to my anxiety. I started sleeping less, waking up each night in a cold sweat, checking to see if he was standing by my window. One night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I thought I heard the door creak. I froze, listening in the darkness. The apartment was quiet, but the thought crossed my mind. What if he managed to get inside? I got up, checked the locks, and went through the whole apartment. But of course, there was no one. I began avoiding going outside, especially at night. But one evening, as I was heading home, I saw him again. This time, he stood right across from my building entrance, as if he was waiting for me. My heart raced. Unable to bear it anymore, I approached him and told him to leave me alone. He looked at me silently, then said, "I just wanted to help." Those words pierced me. Help. Me. What did that mean? I tried to understand, but his face was like stone. He turned and walked away, leaving me in complete confusion. After that, He stopped appearing by my building, but the anxiety never left. I started to suspect that he was still watching, just keeping his distance. I no longer felt safe in my own home, at work, or on the street. Over the next few weeks, I tried to return to a normal life, convincing myself that it was all just my imagination. However, one morning I found a small note on my desk. It was short and written in a hand I didn't recognize. The note simply read, "Be careful." I started seeing him everywhere again, but now he always kept his distance. I realized that he didn't want me to notice his presence directly, but that only made things worse. I felt like I was losing control over my life. I couldn't sleep or eat. The thought that someone was constantly watching me wouldn't leave me for a second. At work, they gave me some time off, thinking I was overworked. That very day, I packed up and moved to another city, hoping to escape this nightmare. After some time, I managed to calm down a little. In my new place, no one was following me, and I began to hope that the nightmare had ended. I didn't tell anyone about it, not friends, not family. I just wanted to forget, to leave it all behind. But one day, as I was coming back from work, I saw him on the street again. As soon as we made eye contact, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving me standing there, feeling my life collapse all over again. When I was offered the job, I was over the moon. It was good money and, more importantly, a decent position with prospects. The only downside was that the office was in another city, so moving was inevitable. I didn't hesitate. A new life, new acquaintances, it all seemed incredible to me at the time. I found an apartment through friends. It was small on the outskirts of the city, but cozy and quiet. There wasn't much space, just one room, a kitchen, and a small bathroom. I'm not the kind who dreams of luxurious apartments. I just wanted it to be clean and quiet. And the silence here was absolute. I even thought it was a plus. The first few days in the new city went surprisingly smoothly. I quickly got into the swing of things at work and started to adjust to my new responsibilities. Everything was going like clockwork, but one evening I felt a strange sense of unease. It happened without any obvious reason. I was just sitting in the living room reading the news on my phone. It seemed like an ordinary evening, but suddenly I felt as if someone was watching me. I put down my phone and looked around. Of course, no one was there. The feeling didn't last long, and I calmed down, deciding it was just the usual jitters of being in a new place. A week passed, and things at work were going better than ever. But at home, strange things began to happen. Sometimes it seemed like something had changed in my apartment. Nothing major, just small details that most people wouldn't even notice. Sometimes the things on my table looked a bit off, or the chair I left by the window was slightly moved. But I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just getting more anxious because of the new job. One night I was awakened by a strange sound, a faint creak, as if someone was cautiously stepping on the wooden floor. The floors in the apartment were indeed old, so at first I chalked it up to the building's age. But the sound repeated, and I realized it wasn't just the old boards someone was moving through my apartment. I froze, listening. Minutes passed and everything fell silent again. The next morning I shrugged off my fear, convincing myself it was just nerves. But after that it became a nightly occurrence. Every night at roughly the same time, I heard those same footsteps. They weren't loud, more like a whisper, but just enough to keep me awake. I began to doubt myself. Gradually I stopped sleeping at night, listening to those steps instead. Naturally, this affected my work. Colleagues noticed I was becoming increasingly irritable and exhausted, but I told no one about my nighttime fears. It sounded too strange. One night, I couldn't take it anymore and set up a camera in the hallway to record overnight. I just wanted to dispel my fears and prove to myself that no one was in the apartment. The next morning, I rushed to check the recording. At first glance, everything looked normal, but then I reached the part where I usually heard the footsteps, and my hair stood on end. The camera had caught faint shifts in light as if someone had passed by, but there was no silhouette or shadow. It seemed impossible. I tried to convince myself it was just a camera glitch, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that I couldn't explain what I had seen. For the next few days, I was careful to check everything in the apartment, even locking all the doors before going to bed. Another night came, and as usual, I lay in the dark, trying to force myself to sleep. Suddenly, I thought I heard not only footsteps, but also light breathing. I froze, my heart racing. The steps were getting closer, and it felt like someone was standing just outside my bedroom door, breathing so softly that I could barely hear it. I thought I was going insane. The next day, I decided to look for a new place, but apartments in this city were expensive and I couldn't afford to move right away. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the result of stress and sleeplessness. But a week later, something happened that made me truly question my sanity. In the evening, when I got home from work, I noticed one of the cups in the kitchen was broken. I lived alone, and the cup couldn't have fallen on its own. I looked around the apartment again and noticed faint, muddy footprints on the floor by the door. They led from the hallway to my bedroom. I froze, feeling a chill run down my spine. Panic set in, and I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I say? That I heard footsteps and found a few dirty marks in my apartment. They would think I was crazy. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed, staring into the darkness, bracing myself for whoever or whatever might appear. The footsteps started again closer to dawn. They were quiet but distinct, and I knew they were coming toward the bedroom. It felt like someone was cautiously but deliberately walking toward me. Suddenly, I felt a faint movement of air as if the door had slightly opened. I didn't know what to do. Fear paralyzed me. The footsteps stopped. I sat there listening to the silence, unable to move. Minutes passed, and I thought it was over. But then I heard someone slowly exhale about a foot away from me. It was too real. I jumped out of bed and turned on the light, but as before, no one was there. The next morning, I made a decision. I had to leave this place. I took a leave from work and found temporary housing with a friend. I spent the next few days away from that apartment, but the feeling of dread lingered. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever or whatever was there was still watching me. A week later, my realtor called, saying they'd found a tenant for my apartment. I signed all the paperwork with relief, knowing I would never return there. It's been a few years since then, but I still remember every detail. Now, whenever I think I hear footsteps in my new apartment, I try to ignore them. But sometimes, when the world outside is completely silent, I feel a chill run over my skin, and I hear that same slow, deep breathing.